She was 7 months pregnant, barefoot on cold marble, picking up the pieces of a shattered casserole dish when her husband straightened his tie, checked his watch, and said, "I'll give you the weekend to pack." But that's not even the worst part. The worst part? While she stood at her mother's graveside 3 weeks earlier, sobbing, barely able to breathe, her best friend had her arm around her shoulders and her husband's number in her drafts. The text read, "How much longer do we have to pretend?" His reply came 3 minutes later. "Soon. Let her grieve. Then we move." She was not a person to them. She was a scheduled inconvenience, and they were so sure she would take the studio apartment, cash the $12,000 check, and disappear quietly because, in their world, she was nobody. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, was that the woman who raised her on thrift store clothes and instant noodles had been quietly sitting on $4.2 billion, and she left every single penny to her daughter. This story is proof that the people who underestimate you are building your revenge for you one cruel assumption at a time. If you've ever been called nobody by someone who needed you to stay small, this one's for you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because on this channel, we tell the stories of women who were counted out and came back counting. Drop a comment below. Has anyone ever underestimated you and lived to regret it?
That power was born not from anger, but from a quiet revelation in a law office overlooking the city. Her mother's attorney, a man as humble as the piano teacher he represented, slid a portfolio across a polished desk. Inside lay the secret Eleanor Calloway had kept for decades, a meticulously managed fortune of $4.2 billion. Every last penny was now Vivian's. In that instant, the grief-stricken daughter of a woman who clipped coupons transformed. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was armor. It was a weapon. And it was a promise that justice would be served. But before she could fight, she had to survive the deepest betrayal. The silence of the penthouse after Grant left was deafening. Her phone rang. It was Delaney, her best friend, her voice oozing with fake concern. The call came exactly 11 minutes after the front door had clicked shut. The timing was too perfect, too rehearsed. A cold dread washed over Vivian as she realized the woman who held her hand at her mother's funeral, who cried on her shoulder, had been sleeping with her husband for 14 months. They had been waiting together for this moment. It all clicked into place. The scent of a strange floral perfume on his collar, the way he'd flipped his buzzing phone face down on the counter. He had placed a thick manila envelope between them, an official document that was less a conversation starter and more an eviction notice. He spoke of a studio apartment, of arrangements already made. It wasn't a discussion, it was a dismissal. She had asked him why, her own voice sounding foreign and fragile, a sound she despised. "We've grown apart, Vivian," he'd said, the gesture of running a hand through his hair, as calculated as it was before an investor meeting. "I need someone who fits my world." He was erasing her, the mother of his unborn child. When she'd asked if there was someone else, his eyes had given him away, shifting to the left for just a fraction of a second. He denied it, but she knew how he looked when he lied. She had spent 2 years learning the subtle geography of his deceptions. She had dropped to her knees then, not to plead, but to start picking up the shards of the broken casserole dish. Porcelain and promises, both shattered on the expensive marble floor. As she cupped the sharp pieces in her palm, her baby kicked hard beneath her ribs, a fierce, tiny reminder that she was not completely alone. Grant watched her for a second, straightened his tie, and said, "I'll give you the weekend." Then he walked out, the sound of his shoes clicking against the stone like a final countdown. She sat on that kitchen floor for hours, the grits drying on the cold marble, the scent of her mother's recipe mixing with a lavender candle. Her mother had been buried just 3 weeks ago. She remembered Grant checking his phone during the service and how she'd made an excuse for him, telling herself some men just didn't know how to handle grief. She saw it clearly now. He wasn't grieving, he was coordinating. Later, she found herself in the pale yellow nursery, a room she'd painted herself while he was closing a deal in Chicago. She sat in the rocking chair she'd found at a flea market, its familiar creak the only comfort in the silence. The proposal on a Tuesday, between meetings, she realized, wasn't romantic spontaneity. It was an item being checked off a to-do list. She pulled out her phone and dialed her mother's number, desperate just to hear her voice on the answering machine. "You've reached Eleanor," the recording began, as warm and steady as rainfall. "Leave something lovely." In the echo of her mother's voice, something inside her shifted. By morning, the tears were gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. Everything that followed, the fight, the victory, the rebirth, it all started in that one singular moment. Barefoot and 7 months pregnant in her kitchen, the casserole dish slipped from Vivian's hands, and her husband said, "We need to talk about the divorce." So that's how it was. It was a small decision, the kind a woman makes when her world has crumbled and she has to figure out why. That single choice led her here to this moment of quiet victory. Grant's iPad sat on the counter where he'd left it, a careless oversight from a man who always underestimated her. It was the bedrock of their marriage, his unshakable belief that she was too soft, too grateful, too naive to ever challenge him. His password was their wedding date, October 14th. A bitter irony. She typed it in. The screen lit up. She went to his messages, and the name at the top sent a shockwave through her. Delaney. Not Delaney Archer, just Delaney, followed by a red heart emoji, the kind of easy familiarity that grows over months. Vivian scrolled back to the start, her hands steady, even as her breath hitched. The texts began 14 months ago. Not weeks, not a few months. 14 months, before their anniversary, before the pregnancy, before her mother got sick, before all of it. There were nicknames. Baby D, my girl. There were secret plans for dinners and hotel rooms, for weekends away when Grant claimed he had business in Dallas or meetings in Boston. There were pictures, Delaney in lingerie, striking a pose in what Vivian instantly recognized as Grant's office. The one overlooking Central Park, the same office where he had proposed. On that Tuesday, she just kept scrolling, each message a deeper cut. One from Delaney, sent the day of Eleanor's funeral, the day Vivian stood in a Virginia cemetery, watching dirt fall on her mother's coffin with her best friend's arm around her. "How much longer do we have to pretend?" Delaney had texted. "I'm tired of being her shoulder to cry on." Grant's reply came 3 minutes later. "Soon. Let her grieve. Then we move." As if Vivian were an object to be relocated, her sorrow just a temporary obstacle before she could be thrown away. She hadn't been imagining things. She knew something was off. The late nights, the distracted silences at dinner, the way his face would flush if she glanced at his phone. The way he stopped saying her name when they were close. The way Delaney always seemed to know his schedule. Deep down, in that primal part of her that senses danger, she had known. She scrolled past the plans and the nicknames, past the pictures and the logistics of their deceit. Then she found the texts about the baby. Grant's words, stark in their gray bubble. "She can have custody. I don't want the kid complicating things." Delaney's reply was a single laughing emoji. Her best friend. Her unborn child. A laughing emoji. The iPad slipped from Vivian's trembling hands. She caught it against her stomach, and the baby kicked. A hard, sudden jolt, right where the screen pressed against her skin, as if her child already understood, already knew to fight. She locked the iPad, then unlocked it again. She locked it and unlocked it, as if the messages could somehow rewrite themselves into something she could survive. As if one more scroll would reveal a different truth, a version where her husband loved her, where her best friend wasn't a traitor, where a laughing emoji meant anything else at all. But the words were permanent. They always are. She dialed Delaney's number, not for a confrontation. She wasn't ready for that. She just needed to hear her voice, to see if it sounded different now that she knew. "Hey, Viv," Delaney chirped, her voice dripping with false concern. "I was just thinking about you. You shouldn't be alone. Come stay with me. I'll make up the guest room. We can watch those terrible movies you love and eat ice cream from the carton." Every word was a perfectly aimed dagger. The warmth, the familiarity, it was all an act, an Oscar-worthy performance. A performance from a woman who had been sleeping with her husband for over a year while holding her hand as her mother died. "Maybe," Vivian managed to say, the word tasting like ash. "I'll think about it." The same words she'd used last night, but now they felt like a steel door slamming shut. She ended the call, walked to the bathroom, and heaved into the sink. It wasn't morning sickness. This was different. This was her body physically rejecting the poison it had been forced to swallow for 14 months. Truth sickness. She rinsed her mouth and looked in the mirror. 30 years old, 7 months pregnant, with dark circles under her eyes and her mother's cardigan hanging off her frame. She didn't look like a woman whose world had just ended. She just looked tired, like she'd been exhausted for a very long time and was only now admitting it. The worst part wasn't the affair. It wasn't the hotels or the lingerie photos. The worst message, the one that shattered everything, was about her baby, a laughing emoji. That's all her child was worth to them. She pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the weight and warmth of the life inside her, a life she already loved more than anything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry you're coming into this." Then she stood up straight, splashed her face with cold water, and dried her hands on a towel monogrammed with Grant's initials. She had work to do. The iPad held more secrets than just the affair. Vivian spent the night not reading baby books, but decoding the digital trail of her husband's betrayal. In the pre-dawn quiet, she found it, a folder in his email labeled Prenup Review. Inside was a conversation between Grant and his lawyer, a man named Douglas Keller. The emails started right after the wedding. "Grant," Douglas had written, "the prenuptial agreement was never properly filed. We need to fix this. Without a valid filing, it's unenforceable." Grant's reply, "I'll handle it." A follow-up from Douglas, 2 months later, was more urgent. "Grant, the prenup remains unfiled. If this isn't addressed, Vivian would be entitled to equitable distribution under New York law." Grant's response, "She's a nobody. She won't fight. Drop it." "She's a nobody. She won't fight." Vivian read it 3 times. The first time, it was a shock. The second, a painful recognition. The third time, it was fuel. Without a valid prenup, she was entitled to half of his $800 million estate. His lawyers had warned him, but his arrogance, his certainty that she was nothing, had blinded him. And it was in that blind spot that her power was hiding. There was more. Another email chain, this one with his mother, Celeste Whitmore, the woman who insisted on being called Mrs. Whitmore, who gave her a monogrammed bathrobe with Grant's initials, who looked at Vivian like she was a stain on the furniture. "Delaney comes from the right family," Celeste had written. "This should have been the match from the beginning. End this quietly." Grant's response, "I'm handling it. She'll take the studio and be grateful." Grateful as if she should thank him for the privilege of being discarded. Vivian closed the iPad and went to the nursery. She sat in the rocking chair and pulled their heavy, leather-bound wedding album from the shelf. She opened it to the first picture, her and Delaney in their freshman dorm room, a space the size of a closet. They'd pushed their beds together that first week because Delaney was scared of thunderstorms. Drunk on cheap wine sophomore year, they'd pinky swore they would be each other's maids of honor, a sacred promise made before they knew what the world did to promises. She turned the page. The proposal. Grant on one knee in his office between meetings. She was wearing sale rack jeans. His suit cost more than her car. She'd always told the story as if it were spontaneous. A man so overcome with love, he couldn't wait. Now she saw the truth. It wasn't a romance. It was a transaction. A scheduled event for a man who treated love like a business deal, a box to be checked on a Tuesday. In the end, it was the photographs that told the whole story. Vivian turned another page in the wedding album, her eyes landing on her mother, Eleanor, captured in a simple blue dress she had made herself. She was smiling by the cake, but now Vivian saw the truth she'd missed that day. A careful, worried look in her mother's eyes. It brought back Eleanor's whispered warning in the church bathroom just minutes before the ceremony. While fixing Vivian's veil, she had said, "He loves what you give him, Vivian. Make sure he loves who you are." She finally understood. The last photo was of Delaney's toast. Her best friend stood in a green dress, mascara smudged from happy tears, raising a champagne glass. "To my best friend," she'd said, "who deserves the world." But the camera caught a fleeting glance, a look not for Vivian, but for Grant, and he was looking right back. Vivian gently closed the album and placed it on the shelf. She would never need to open it again. All she needed now was to breathe. She just needed to breathe. Walking into the bathroom, she turned the faucet and filled the tub with warm water. She stepped in with all her clothes on, her mother's old cardigan, the maternity dress, everything. As she sank to her chin, the water felt heavy and warm, soaking through the layers of fabric. Her hands floated over her stomach, where the baby turned slowly, peacefully, knowing nothing of the world outside. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered. "Just you and me." She stayed like that for 20 minutes, not crying or screaming, only listening to the sound of the water and the quiet movements of her child. When she finally climbed out, she dripped all over the marble floor, a mess in Grant's perfect bathroom. She didn't care. Wrapped in a towel, she left a trail of wet footprints to the foyer just as the doorbell rang. It was a young courier, maybe 20, holding a thick, legal envelope from a law firm she had never heard of, Hargrove Price and Associates. She signed for the package, closed the door, and stood dripping in the hallway, the envelope clutched in her hands. It was addressed to Vivian Calloway, the sole surviving heir of Eleanor Hargrove Calloway. Hargrove, her mother's maiden name. A name Eleanor never spoke of, a name that didn't fit into any of the stories Vivian knew. Not the one about meeting her father in a Richmond jazz club, or why she taught piano, or how she raised a daughter in a 2-bedroom Virginia apartment on that salary, with a small garden of tomatoes out back. The letter inside requested her presence for the reading of her mother's estate, using words she didn't recognize: substantial holdings, controlling interest, trust provisions, fiduciary responsibility. Her first instinct was to throw it away, just another man in a suit trying to complicate her life. But that name, Hargrove, stopped her. It felt heavy, like a locked door she'd been walking past her whole life, thus completely unaware. She placed the mystery envelope On the kitchen counter, right beside the divorce papers. There they were. One from the man who wanted to erase her, and one from the mother who, it now seemed, had hidden an entire world from her. She didn't open it yet. It was a choice between her pride and her security, her dignity and the future of her baby. Sacrificing either felt impossible. Keeping both seemed just as unlikely. Standing in the kitchen, her wet cardigan forming a puddle on the floor, she stared at the two envelopes. The prenup meant to leave her with nothing had, she now knew, never been filed. And this letter from her dead mother's lawyers could change the entire game. But not tonight. Tonight she was just a woman, 7 months pregnant, trying to remember how to breathe. The next morning, she called the law firm. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number from the letterhead, expecting to get a receptionist. Instead, a man's voice answered on the second ring, warm and unhurried. It was the kind of voice that had all the time in the world. "Malcolm Price," he said. "This is Vivian Calloway. I'm calling about a letter regarding my mother's estate." There was a pause, not an awkward one, but the kind a man takes when choosing his words with care, like a doctor about to deliver life-altering news. "Vivian, I've been hoping you would call. Your mother mentioned you often. She was so very proud." "You knew my mother?" "For over 30 years. She was a remarkable woman." "May I ask, did Eleanor ever happen to mention the Hargrove family to you?" Vivian Ann sank onto the edge of her bed, the mattress creaking. Outside, the morning light made Manhattan sparkle, indifferent, beautiful, and cruel. "No," she said. "My mother was a piano teacher. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Virginia," Vivian continued. "She drove a 15-year-old sedan, clipped coupons from the paper, and made soup from leftover vegetables. She never mentioned any Hargrove family." Malcolm Price was silent for a beat. Then, with the words he spoke next, he completely dismantled the foundation of Vivian's entire life. "Your mother was the eldest daughter of Franklin Hargrove, the founder of Hargrove Industrial, one of the largest privately held companies in the southeastern United States. At 22, she walked away from her family, changed her name, and chose a different life. But she never walked away from her inheritance." Vivian sat down hard. The room seemed to tilt as the baby kicked. For a second, she couldn't tell if the dizziness was from the news or her pregnancy. "I don't understand," she managed to say. "Your mother kept her stake in the company through a very carefully structured trust. She grew it over the years with strategic investments managed by her brother, Theodore. She also created a foundation to support music education in rural communities," he went on. "All of it was done quietly, deliberately. Your mother was likely the most private wealthy person I have ever had the honor to represent." "How much?" Vivian's question felt ridiculous. Like standing on the beach and asking how deep the ocean is. "The total estate is valued at approximately $4.2 billion. The number didn't even make sense. $4.2 billion. The woman who patched her jeans with old curtain fabric, who worked 10-hour days teaching piano to kids who couldn't afford fancy instruments, the woman who wept with joy when Vivian won a full scholarship because it meant she wouldn't have to worry. $4.2 billion. Vivian's first feeling wasn't happiness or relief. It was pure, sharp anger. "She never told me," she said, her voice tight, holding back a flood. "My entire life, I worked 2 jobs through college. I wore clothes from thrift stores," she continued, "and ate instant noodles for dinner 4 nights a week." She watched me struggle, and she never said a single word. "She wanted you to know who you were without the money," Malcolm said gently. "She saw what wealth did to her own family. Her father used it as a weapon, and her brother Theodore became a product of it. Eleanor wanted something better for you. She wanted you to build a foundation that could never be bought or taken from you. She was planning to tell you. She really was." She had a timeline, for after the baby arrived. She even wrote you a letter. It's with the estate documents. Would you like me to read it, or would you prefer I send it? Send it to me, Vivian said. Please. The letter arrived in her email 20 minutes later. Vivian went to the nursery to read it. The room with pale yellow walls, the crib she'd built herself, the rocking chair that creaked just so. She opened the email, and her mother's careful cursive filled the screen. The letter was tucked inside a book of lullabies, found among birthday cards and old grocery lists. My dearest Vivian, it began, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I never told you everything in person. Vivian read how her mother had walked away from the Hargrove name because wealth had made her family cruel, men who measured love in dollars. I wanted you to understand your worth was never a number, she'd written, but this money is yours now. Use it to be free. Be kind. As Vivian absorbed the words, a deep, shuddering sob escaped her, the first true cry since the funeral. It wasn't the polite, tissue-dabbing sorrow from the cemetery. It was a raw, guttural grief that shook her entire body. She cried for the mother who loved her enough to let her find her own way, who chose a life of simplicity over one of poison, all to give her a daughter who knew her own strength without a fortune to back it up. And if anyone ever makes you feel small, the letter concluded, remember you were never small. You just didn't know how tall you stood. She folded the worn paper, pressing it to her chest as she rocked back and forth, the same way her mother once soothed her. Soon, she would rock her own child this way. The baby kicked, and a wet, ragged laugh broke through her tears. Your grandmother, she whispered to her belly, was the most incredible woman who ever lived, and she left us everything. The weight of $4.2 billion settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle. She picked up her phone and dialed Malcolm Price. Malcolm, she said, her voice steady, I need this kept entirely confidential. No announcements, no press, and no contact with my husband or his lawyers. There was a brief silence on the line. Of course, he replied. May I ask why? A small smile touched her lips. Because I want to see who people truly are when they think I have nothing. A quiet, respectful laugh came through the phone, the sound of a man who recognized Eleanor Hargrove's daughter. Your mother, he said, would be incredibly proud. The call from Grant had come that Thursday. His tone was brisk, the same one he used with contractors. I need you out by Friday, he'd stated. I'm having a guest move in. A guest. He couldn't even grant her the dignity of saying the other woman's name. I've arranged for $12,000 a month in temporary support, he continued, as if the pittance from his $800 million fortune was a grand gesture. It was like a king tossing a single coin to a beggar and calling it charity. Fine, Vivian had replied, her voice hollow. I'll be out by Friday. Good, he said. I'm glad we can be adults about this. As if cheating on your pregnant wife, 3 weeks after her mother's funeral, was a sign of maturity. Let him think I'm broken, she had thought, standing in the cold, unfamiliar penthouse. Let him think I'm grateful for his scraps. She knew she could buy his company and pave it over, but her mother had taught her to build, not to destroy. When Friday arrived, she went to the apartment with a single suitcase, expecting the worst. But what she found was a new level of audacity. Delaney was there, lounging in Vivian's white silk robe, a Christmas gift from her mother, sipping coffee from her favorite blue mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Mom." She was already making herself at home, possessing the space as if Vivian was the intruder. Vivi, Delaney said, moving in for a hug, the picture of a concerned best friend. I'm so sorry, Delaney cooed, her performance flawless. I never wanted this to happen. I know how hard this must be. The words were perfect, but Vivian had seen the text messages, She could have almost believed the act, fallen into that embrace, and never known it was all a lie. "When did it start?" Vivian asked, her voice devoid of emotion. A tiny crack appeared in Delaney's porcelain facade. "What do you mean?" "I read the messages," Vivian said flatly. 14 months. All the color vanished from Delaney's face, only to return with a hard, cold resolve. The mask was off. "Fine," she snapped, the warmth gone from her voice. "You want the truth? He was never really yours." "We had a connection you couldn't understand," Delaney said, her tone sharp and dry. "Honestly, you should have seen it coming." "I deserve better than this," Vivian stated, not as a plea, but as a simple fact. Just then, Grant walked in from the bedroom, exuding the confidence of a man who owned the building. "Let's not make this ugly, Vivian," he said, using her full name to create distance. He moved to stand beside Delaney, his hand resting on her back. A united front, the husband and the best friend, standing in her kitchen, in her robe, telling her not to cause a scene. They already looked like a couple, comfortable and practiced, and that's what stung the most. How long it had been happening right under her nose. She packed only one suitcase. She left the designer clothes, the expensive shoes, and all the jewelry Grant had ever given her. None of it had ever truly been hers anyway. She took just 4 things: her mother's favorite cardigan, the first ultrasound picture of her baby, a heavy cast iron skillet, and the letter from Hargrove, Price, and Associates. Downstairs, the doorman, Roberto, stood by the elevator, his hands clasped, his face etched with sorrow. For 2 years, he had carried her groceries and shared jokes with her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered, his expression pained as the doors slid shut. The elevator doors slid shut. With a soft chime, the numbers began their descent. 27, 26, 25. Each floor marked another layer of the life she was shedding. By the time she reached the lobby, she was no longer Grant Whitmore's wife. She was Vivian Calloway, Eleanor's daughter. "You deserve much better," Roberto had said, and she had squeezed his hand, replying, "I know. I finally know." In her car, she sat for a long time, hands on the wheel, the cool leather a grounding presence. The baby kicked. She was done being small. That newfound strength had been forged in the quiet comfort of her mother's apartment, a place that still smelled of lavender and lemon furniture polish. Vivian had stood in the doorway, breathing in a scent so vivid, it almost resurrected her mother. For a heartbeat, she expected to hear Eleanor humming Chopin in the kitchen, but the stillness was absolute. She'd set her suitcase down by the coat rack, where her mother's navy blue wool coat still hung, a button missing from its cuff. Under the window sat the Baldwin upright piano, its sheet music still open to Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. Her mother's reading glasses were on the kitchen counter next to a half-finished crossword from a Tuesday paper. Eleanor had died on a Wednesday. Vivian had walked through the silent rooms, touching everything, searching for the shape of the woman she'd lost. She ran her fingers over the cracked spine of a book, saw the dead herbs on the windowsill, and opened drawers not for anything specific, but just to look. In the bedroom closet, she found it, a locked cedar box, its wood dark and smooth from decades of handling. A hairpin from the vanity worked the lock open, revealing photographs hidden from the world. In one, a stunning young woman with dark hair and a strong jaw stood on the steps of a mansion. It took Vivian a moment to recognize her mother, Eleanor Hargrove, at around 20 years old. Behind her stood her stern, silver-haired father and her uncle. Another clipping, a society page from 1978, announced Eleanor Hargrove as a debutante at the Richmond Cotillion. Her mother, the woman who made soup from vegetable scraps, had once worn white gloves and stood before a home that could have been a museum. The woman who drove a 15-year-old sedan had belonged to a family worth billions. Vivian sat on the closet floor, clutching the photos, too exhausted for tears. As night fell, the apartment grew cold. The old furnace produced only a lukewarm sigh. She wrapped herself in every blanket she could find, while the baby inside her turned and kicked with a strange urgency. Then, at 2 in the morning, the contractions started, fast and sharp, like a fist clenching deep inside her. She was having Braxton Hicks contractions, practice for the real thing. At 7 months, they weren't usually dangerous, but alone, in a cold apartment, with no one to call, not usually felt like, certainly. It felt like the end of the world. A baby was trying to arrive 2 months early, and not a single person knew where she was. She dialed the only number she could think of, her OBGYN's emergency line. Dr. Harmon, a calm professional voice answered. It's Vivian Calloway. I'm having contractions. Okay, Vivian, listen to me. I need you to breathe, Dr. Harmon instructed, guiding her through slow, counted breaths. The fist inside her unclenched. The doctor reassured her that both she and the baby were safe, but asked her to come in the next morning. After hanging up, Vivian lay on her mother's bed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like a hand. Everyone leaves, she thought. My father, my mother, my husband, my best friend. What do I have? A baby who doesn't know yet. At 3:17 in the morning, she typed, "Can you survive a divorce while pregnant?" into her phone's search bar, then deleted it. She typed, "How to be a single mother," and deleted that too. Finally, she wrote, "I feel so alone," stared at the words, and erased them before closing her eyes to wait for the sun. Morning always comes. It arrived with a soft but insistent knock at the door. It was Ruby Bennett, her Aunt Ruby, holding a grocery bag and a thermos of coffee. Your mama would haunt me if I let you sit in this cold apartment alone, Ruby said, pushing past her. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations. She just started cracking eggs, turned up the heat, and opened the curtains to let in the light. She set a plate with an omelet in front of Vivian. I know about the money, Ruby said, her eyes full of a wisdom that knew when words were useless. I know about Grant, and I know you're stronger than you think. But right now, you just have to eat. And Vivian ate. As she did, Ruby began the story, laying out the history of the Hargrove family. She spoke of Vivian's grandfather, Franklin Hargrove, a ruthless industrialist who built an empire from a single machine shop. So that's how it was. She had fled her broken life by packing one suitcase, taking only what couldn't be replaced. She'd pulled out of the garage, merged into traffic, and driven south to Virginia, to her mother's empty apartment, the only place that still felt like home. Eleanor was different, Ruby explained, sipping her coffee. She was smart and kind, but she was being suffocated. Your grandfather, Franklin, wanted her to marry a banker's son. It was a merger, not a marriage. She refused. In front of 40 people at a dinner party, Franklin had publicly cut her off, telling her she'd be nothing without the Hargrove name. And she left, Vivian realized aloud. That very night, at 22, she walked out with just a suitcase and her piano books. She changed her last name to Calloway, got a job teaching music, and met Vivian's father at a jazz club. But the money? Vivian began. Ruby leaned in. Here's the thing about your mother. She was gentle, but she wasn't a fool. She never legally renounced her inheritance. Franklin had set up the trust to be irrevocable. So the money just sat there, growing, all these years. The doorbell chimed, and Malcolm Price was standing on the welcome mat. A thin, tall man with graying temples, his dark suit impeccable. He carried a leather briefcase, that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. As Ruby smiled, a look blending immense pride with a shadow of sorrow, she spoke of Eleanor. She was, Ruby said, the wealthiest piano teacher in all of America and the most joyful woman she had ever known. Eleanor had allowed her fortune to flourish through quiet, brilliant investments managed reluctantly by Theodore, who was bound by a family trust. She had established a foundation Vivian now knew from Malcolm's files, called the Eleanor Callaway Foundation for Music Education in Rural Communities, funded anonymously with a $200 million endowment. The children learning piano, the teachers receiving new instruments, none knew their benefactor was a woman who drove a 15-year-old sedan and lived in a simple two-bedroom apartment. Malcolm held Vivian's hand a moment too long, his grip conveying a deep connection. "You look just like her," he said softly. They gathered around the table, Vivian, Ruby, and the lawyer. He opened the briefcase, revealing a fortress of legal documents, dense with language and numbers that trailed into an impossible number of zeros. With steady patience, Malcolm guided her through the details of her inheritance. The black ink on the white paper spelled out the full scope of it. A controlling stake in Hargrove Industrial, valued around $2.8 billion, encompassing factories, distribution centers, and supply lines across the Southeast. Then came the real estate, worth an estimated $900 million. Office buildings, malls, and sprawling apartment complexes across 6 states. Finally, an art collection valued at $300 million, featuring artists Vivian only recognized from museum trips with her mother, who had never hinted at owning their work. And of course, there was the Eleanor Callaway Foundation. In total, it was $4.2 billion, left by a woman who patched her own clothes and cultivated tomatoes on her fire escape. A separate trust, created for Vivian's future children, would activate at their birth. "One last thing," Malcolm added. "Your uncle, Theodore Hargrove, wants to meet you. He and Eleanor were estranged for decades, yet he honored every financial directive she made. He is 78 with no heirs. You are the last Hargrove." Vivian responded quietly, "My mother gave me something far more precious than $4 billion. She gave me a life where I learned my own worth, separate from it." Malcolm nodded as Ruby gently squeezed her hand. Then, in a move Grant would never have anticipated, Vivian didn't contact a realtor or a private jet charter. She called Grant's lawyer, Douglas Keller. "Mr. Keller," she said, "I have a single question. Is the prenuptial agreement between Grant Whitmore and Vivian Callaway officially filed with the court?" A heavy silence filled the line, followed by the faint clicks of a keyboard, the rustle of papers. When Douglas Keller finally spoke again, his confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tremor of fear. "I will have to get back to you on that." Vivian hung up, and, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. The $4.2 billion made the prenup irrelevant, but she wanted Grant to feel that cold dread, to understand the terror of the ground crumbling beneath his feet. She went to her mother's piano and struck a single key, middle C. The note hung in the air, pure and clear. She let it vanish, then pressed it again, harder, filling the small apartment with a sound like a voice finally returning after a long, enforced silence. The 2 weeks that followed were a study in quiet efficiency. No dramatic scenes, just the silent, grinding gears of justice. She hired Malcolm Price and his firm, who promptly filed a countersuit in the divorce. The grounds were adultery, emotional cruelty during her pregnancy, and the fact that the prenup was invalid. She requested half of Grant's entire estate, not for the money, but to make him comprehend that his dismissive text, "She's a nobody," was the costliest sentence he would ever compose. Grant got the papers on a Monday morning. He called her at 11:15, his voice stripped of its usual calm, practiced tone. The polished surface had shattered, revealing raw panic. "What game are you playing?" he snarled. "You were nothing before me." Vivian sat in Eleanor's kitchen, the scent of Ruby's cornbread a comforting balm. "I was everything before you," she said softly. "I simply forgot." Then she ended the call. Ruby continued her work at the stove, but a small smile touched her lip. The next day, Owen Merritt, Grant's business partner of 8 years, placed a call. Owen was the firm's quiet backbone, the one managing projects and contractors, while Grant served as the charismatic face. "Vivian," he began, his tone careful, "I feel you should be aware of some things that have been troubling me." He explained that Grant was concealing assets, funneling money to offshore accounts, and using company funds for lavish personal gifts, including a car for someone who wasn't her. He was making desperate, high-risk deals to plug the financial holes. "Thank you for telling me, Owen," she said. "He is not the man I started this business with," Owen confessed. "I'm beginning to think he never was." She forwarded the information to her lawyers, another solid brick laid in the wall of truth that was steadily closing in on Grant Whitmore. The final confrontation happened on a Wednesday. He chose Margot's, their old spot, a French restaurant with white tablecloths and exorbitant prices. It was a calculated move, an attempt to put her on his turf. He brought Delaney, another power play. Delaney brandished a massive new cushion-cut diamond on her left hand like a war trophy. But Vivian arrived transformed. She was rested, sustained by Ruby's cooking and the quiet strength of her mother's apartment. She wore a simple black dress and Eleanor's pearl earrings, stripped of any designer armor Grant had bought her. She was just herself. As she sat across from them and ordered sparkling water, she waited. Grant, as always, spoke first. "Let's make this simple," he began. "Sign the papers. You can have the apartment and $12,000 a month. Just be reasonable." Vivian's voice, when she replied, was steady and unfamiliar even to her. It was her mother's voice. "I have a counteroffer. You give me what the law entitles me to, considering there is no valid prenup, and in return, I will not pursue the adultery clause." The color drained from Grant's face, leaving it a stark, bloodless white. It was the look of a gambler discovering his ace was never in the deck. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "Your lawyer confirmed it. The prenup was never filed." Delaney jumped in, too quickly. "She's bluffing." Vivian turned her gaze on the woman who was once her closest friend and saw nothing. Not anger, not hate, just a void. "I'm not," she said. "And I never was." That's when Grant's control finally broke. His hand slammed the table, making the wine glasses jump. The entire restaurant fell silent. As a nervous waiter approached, Grant snarled at him, an animalistic sound of pure rage. Delaney grabbed his arm, her expression tight with fear, not of Vivian, but of the man she was now tied to. She was getting a front-row seat to her future, and it was nothing like the life she had imagined. Vivian calmly signed the check, her hand perfectly still, and walked out of Margot's. For the very last time, the fallout was swift. Grant's new lawyer was aggressive, filing motions with relentless speed. That evening, Celeste Whitmore called, her voice like polished ice. "You will not be the one to ruin my son's reputation," she warned over 45 seconds. "Mrs. Whitmore," Vivian replied calmly, "your son already buried himself. I am merely planting flowers on the grave." She hung up before Celeste could respond. A week later, she drove to a home outside Richmond that resembled a small museum to meet Theodore Hargrove, the uncle her mother had left behind. He was frail, shrunken by years of solitude, but his blue eyes were sharp with regret. He looked at her, and his face crumpled. "My God," he wept, "you are the image of Eleanor." He invited her in, and as Vivian stepped across the threshold of the life her mother had fled, she remembered why she had needed to find that strength in the first place. She remembered standing in the cold, marble foyer of Grant's penthouse, the sting of his final text burning on her phone. "You are a nobody." Pregnant, shattered, and utterly alone, she had walked out, leaving it all behind to go to the one place she knew she would always be a somebody, her mother's home. The piano note rang through the brownstone, clear and true. Baby Eleanor stilled on Vivian's lap, her tiny grandmother's fingers reaching for the keys as her mother began to play. She played with her eyes closed, just as she'd been taught, feeling the music that had filled her own childhood evenings. The melody floated from the open windows into the Virginia night, a sound of pure peace. This quiet moment, in this house, was what it had all been for. It had all been settled at the kitchen counter, between a salt shaker and a sippy cup. One signature, with a $2 pin, 3 seconds of her time, and $4.2 billion, had changed hands. A quiet transfer that represented the end of an empire and the beginning of a life. It was the most ordinary act, marking the most extraordinary moment, securing the future for herself and her daughter. But she hadn't taken the $800 million she was entitled to. Her stunned lawyers watched as she left hundreds of millions on the table. She demanded only what was fair for the baby, a trust fund, health care, and a father who had to complete 6 months of therapy to earn custodial rights. She wasn't punishing him with poverty. She was protecting her child from his poison. Her victory in court was absolute because the evidence was undeniable. Her legal team methodically laid out the case. The emotional cruelty during her pregnancy, the blatant adultery, and an invalid prenup. They presented documented proof of hidden accounts and company funds diverted for personal use. Grant's attorneys filed motions and objected, but the judge listened sympathetically as the truth was revealed. The proof of his financial crimes had come from his own business partner, who quietly cited irreconcilable differences in ethics. The proof of his cruelty came from his new lover. Delaney's call came late on a Tuesday, her voice breaking. "He's not who I thought he was." From the warmth of her mother's kitchen, Vivian simply listened, and when the sobbing stopped, she replied, "I know, I married him." Delaney was learning firsthand. She now lived in the cold penthouse, wore the robe Vivian left behind, and endured the same punishing silence after arguments. Grant monitored her phone, criticized her clothes, and withdrew affection like a banker freezing an account. It was the same technique he'd used on Vivian, designed to make a person smaller, inch by inch, until they fit inside the box he built for them. The news didn't break with a press conference or a calculated leak. It arrived with the force of an earthquake. Its epicenter, a series of quiet, powerful actions too significant to remain hidden. The Eleanor Callaway Foundation announced 50 new music programs for underserved schools. A state-of-the-art music academy was planned for her mother's old Virginia neighborhood. A privately funded prenatal clinic bearing Vivian Callaway's name opened its doors. A local reporter finally connected the dots, and the headline in the Richmond Times-Dispatch sent ripples nationwide. Piano teacher's daughter revealed as Hargrove industrial heiress. It was a story America devoured, a secret billionaire, a humble life, a tale of betrayal, and a fortune reclaimed. Across town, Grant saw it all on his office monitor. Alone. Owen was gone, the investors had vanished, and Celeste no longer answered his calls. He watched Vivian's face on the screen, feeling his own turn to ash, the color of a man realizing the woman he'd dismissed as a nobody was worth 5 times his entire empire. He dialed her number. No answer. He tried Malcolm Price, but an assistant informed him coolly, Miss Calloway is permanently unavailable. In the penthouse, Delaney saw it too, wrapped in Vivian's robe, drinking from Vivian's mug. The engagement ring from Grant, a massive cushion-cut diamond, suddenly felt like a lead weight. She'd traded a life with a billionaire's wife to be a trophy for a tyrant. The newscaster butchered the name Hargrove, pronouncing it with a hard G. But Vivian wasn't listening. She was far too busy building a new life, starting with a simple crib in a new room. This victory wasn't about money or headlines. It was about reclaiming a future. It was about proving to herself what her mother always knew. She mattered because of who she was, not what she had. He'd tried to punish her with irrelevance. But she had simply chosen irrelevance that didn't include him. The true victory had been won months earlier in the quiet of a hospital room. That moment arrived on an October Sunday, announced by a pressure at 4:15 in the morning that was nothing like the Braxton Hicks she'd felt in her mother's chilly apartment. This was real, deep, and unapologetic. It was the kind of certainty that changes everything. She called her doctor, then Ruby, then dressed in the dark, and drove herself to the hospital. Vivian Calloway no longer waited for anyone. Ruby burst in 20 minutes later, hair wild over her pajama top, gasping, "I broke 3 speed limits. Your mama would have broken 4." For 11 hours, Vivian didn't scream. She breathed, she counted, she held Ruby's hand until her knuckles went white. At 3:22 in the afternoon, she arrived. 8 pounds, 2 ounces of pure, furious life. The baby didn't cry. She screamed, a full-throated declaration to the world. "I am here. Make room." They placed the warm, wrinkled, impossibly small person on Vivian's chest, and every bone in her body seemed to shift, rearranging itself around this new center of her universe. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, Eleanor Ruby Calloway." Her mother's name, Ruby's name, a name of strength. Beside the bed, Ruby wept and laughed, saying, "Oh, Eleanor, your grandmother would be an absolute mess right now." Theodore Hargrove waited in the hall, driven 3 hours from Richmond with Eleanor's favorite flowers, pink peonies. When invited in, his sharp blue eyes softened as he looked at the baby. "She has Eleanor's hands," he said, and it was true. Long, strong fingers, destined for a piano. That was the circle of her real family. Grant's only presence was a one-word text from his attorney an hour later. "Congratulations." Vivian read it, put her phone down, and picked up her daughter, offering no reply. A handwritten card from Owen Merritt arrived the next day. It read, "She's lucky to have you as her mother." And she pinned it to the nursery wall, where it remained for years. The 6 months that followed were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and tiny miracles. Vivian moved into a Virginia brownstone, not a mansion, but a home with a garden and a porch for watching fireflies. Her mother's Baldwin piano sat in the front window, bathed in the afternoon sun, Eleanor's playmat on the floor beside it. From the kitchen table, surrounded by baby bottles and half-eaten sandwiches, she built her new world, funding the music school, opening the clinic, and establishing a scholarship for single mothers, all named for Eleanor. She saw Delaney that April in a coffee shop. The woman was a ghost of her former self, thinned by stress, dark circles under her eyes. The brilliant engagement ring was gone. "Vivian," she began, her voice cracking, but Vivian gently raised a hand. It wasn't about anger anymore. "I don't need an apology," she said softly. "I need you to learn from it." She walked out, leaving Delaney with a cooling latte and the weight of a 14-month mistake. That was the same month the SEC began investigating Grant's company, prompted by a tip from a disgruntled investor. The investigation unearthed everything: the offshore accounts, the diverted funds, the reckless gambles with other people's money. Celeste retreated into a world of operas and art museums, pretending her son didn't exist. Delaney left him in the middle of the night, a single suitcase in hand. Grant was left alone in the penthouse, at the same kitchen counter where he'd served her divorce papers, where the casserole dish had shattered the marble. The cracks had been repaired, but he could still feel them. It was then Vivian finally understood. The cage had never been Grant. It was the belief that she was small without him. The prison door had been unlocked the entire time. Her mother had given her two priceless gifts: a life raised with nothing, to teach her what she was worth on her own, and a fortune, to show her what she could accomplish with everything. It all began on a warm Tuesday evening, almost 2 years to the day Grant had proposed. Baby Eleanor was in her high chair, happily banging a spoon. Vivian was at the stove, making her mother's shrimp and grits in the heavy cast-iron skillet, the only thing she'd taken from the penthouse. The kitchen smelled of butter and lavender. Then the doorbell rang. On the porch stood Malcolm Price, a folder in his hand and a gentle smile on his face, ready to deliver the final transfer of the Hargrove Trust. Her strength hadn't come from nowhere. It came from a family she never knew she had. Her uncle Theodore, filled with regret for not protecting his sister years ago, offered her everything: the Hargrove legal teams, the financial advisors, a 50-year-old network of power. Vivian accepted, but only on her own terms. No publicity, no power plays. "I want to protect my child," she had said. That was all. In her mother's old kitchen, stories of Eleanor filled the air with the scent of butter and spice. She learned of a stubborn, fearless girl who argued with her own powerful father. A girl who told him that money without kindness was just paper. A woman who had chosen love over legacy, struggle over cruelty, and a life where she could raise a daughter free from the family poison. Vivian chose to be like her mother, the woman who chose love over cruelty. She had to learn that strength because her own story of struggle began on the day her world was shattered. It happened just 3 weeks after her mother's funeral, while she was pregnant and alone, when her husband Grant served her with divorce papers. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.